Oftentimes, when people discuss the age of imperialism in Africa, they refer to it as the scramble for Africa, almost kind of mentally painting this picture that one day there was no Europeans, and then the next day everybody was rushing in to kind of gobble up a piece. In many ways, that vivid image is very much true. And anybody that studies something like the Berlin Conference will immediately see how profound the transformation in terms of political boundaries and territory ownership was before and after that international conference. Today on the podcast, we're going to focus on really a part of Africa that I would say is much more the exception to that rule than anywhere else, whose history of European ownership and settlement predates the Berlin Conference by over 200 years. The country in question is, of course, South Africa. So today we're going to delve into kind of the background on the establishment of the South African state, how it comes under the British fold, and specifically how the interactions between three people, the Boers, the British, and the Zulu, helped to create the modern society that becomes a major flashpoint in the latter part of the 20th century. The story of South Africa really starts, of course, with the native peoples that had lived there for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years. A variety of ethnic groups that were primarily Khoisan peoples at their root. And the Khoisans were then subdivided into a whole bunch of smaller sub-ethnic groups that all came from that common language family. The most notable being people like the Zulu or the Xhosa, but there's even a variety of much smaller ethnic groups. Probably one that some people have heard of before is the San, that many Westerners refer to as Bushmen, and the San are pretty much a hunter-gatherer peoples that in many parts of South Africa still practice that traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Well, it's into this kind of disunified environment that the first Europeans show up in the latter part of the 1400s. And of course, the only Europeans that were sailing anywhere to the east during that time were the Portuguese. There's records, that show that the Portuguese did put in South Africa, but that they really weren't overly impressed with what they saw. That they were concerned about the rocky shoreline, that there was all sorts of difficult kind of currents. And so when the Portuguese ultimately set up a base in southern Africa to use as a jump-off point for locations to the east, they're actually going to settle the eastern coast, what becomes modern-day Mozambique. They find that to be a much more beneficial and easy-to-access location. The first Europeans then that really start to use South Africa as a colonial possession is the Dutch, the country of the Netherlands. And why they found South Africa as a colony eventually in the 1650s is that they had a very great need for a stopover refueling port on their way to their main location or their main colony in the Dutch East Indies, modern day Indonesia. Some of the big concerns for Dutch sailors that sailed with the Dutch East India Company was that by the time they got to kind of the southern tip of Africa, they were oftentimes lacking clean water, or the water had been fouled and was giving people dysentery or other kind of digestive system problems. They oftentimes lacked fresh fruit and vegetables, and lacking access then to vitamin C, many sailors, which was a common sailor problem throughout the world, would then succumb to scurvy, a major vitamin deficiency that would cause, a yellowing of the skin and eyes, that would cause things like fingernails to become very brittle, that would cause your gums to bleed and your teeth to fall out and your hair to fall out. So it was something that, the Dutch had this really pressing need to figure out a way to get access to fresh fruits and vegetables before they made that really long jaunt across the Indian Ocean. Well, if you look at a map, literally South Africa is the halfway point between the Netherlands and modern day Indonesia. Where they first start, though, kind of, I guess, kicking around this idea is actually by accident. As the story is oftentimes told, in 1647, there was actually a Dutch ship that wrecked off the coast, and the sailors managed to survive shark-infested water and swim to the shore. And when they arrived on the shore, they built there kind of a small little fort. They survived by, hunting and gathering and trading with the native peoples. And literally about a year later, they were discovered by another Dutch merchant ship, which then got the Dutch East India Company thinking, well, if these people could survive and thrive, what if we brought more people here? What if we bring farmers here and have them farm crops? Or what if we bring, merchants here and have them trade with the native peoples to supply us with more, fresh beef or other protein sources? What if we can pull this off? Well, at first, the venture was somewhat unsuccessful. They found that the native peoples didn't really want to trade with them and didn't really have much interest in dealing with Europeans. And so the Dutch, in the second half of the 17th century, start importing in thousands of farmers and laborers, in essence, to create a dependent society. These people became known as the Boers. And if you're wondering, well, why the heck do they give them the name of swine? Why the Boers? Well, Boer is a Dutch word, and if you translate Boer into English, it literally means farmer. So it was simply the Dutch word for, hey, here's a bunch of farmers that we're dumping in this part of the world to supply us with food. Now, I don't want you to have this image that all the Boers were Dutch. The bulk of them were, and the thing that this new kind of established colony also served as a purpose, other than just food supply for mercantile ships, is that it gave the Netherlands somewhere to dispose of a surplus population. The Netherlands is a country that has really always been one of the most urbanized nations in Europe. They do not have a ton of farmland to give to a growing population. And so you had a lot of poor, kind of desperate farmers that were looking for a new start and looking for better opportunities. And this matched perfectly with a company that was looking for farmers to supply them in a different part of the world. In addition to being Dutch, some of these Boers, were Germans, some were Scandinavians. Some were even French Huguenots, because really this colony, which becomes known as Cape Colony, really gets its start at the same time that Louis XIV is ruling in France and revoking the Edict of Nantes and causing that group to flee France's shores in large numbers. So these farmers settle in South Africa. They kind of develop their own unique culture and lifestyle. Another name often given to this group as well, other than Boers, which is kind of a synonym, is that they're oftentimes referred to as Afrikaners. And so if you were to ask somebody in South Africa today, what group do you identify with? What's your ethnic heritage or lineage? They're probably not going to say Boer. They're probably going to refer to themselves by the more common modern term, Afrikaner. And with this, they developed their own kind of unique language called Afrikaans. If you ever get a chance to hear Afrikaans, one thing that you'll notice is that it's very much kind of a blending of languages. There's definitely Dutch elements to it. There's definitely some kind of English words thrown in there. There's some, German influence as well. So you'll notice very quickly how this reflects the groups that all kind of settle in South Africa over hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, when the Boers, the Afrikaners, come in, they very quickly start to spread out more into the interior. They encroach in traditional, African lands. There's a significant amount of conflict that takes place. but they also enslave a lot of the native peoples. And with enslaving native peoples, they're also bringing in, cheap slaves and forced labor from Indonesia. So this is actually one of the reasons why if you go to South Africa today, you'll actually find a very multicultural society of people really from all around the world. And that reflects this kind of initial colonial period as well. Some Boers, moved into the interior and became herders that lived, basically in covered wagons and were constantly on the move. Some lived in mud and sod houses. As a whole, the Boers were a very, very kind of independent people. They were a very kind of militant Calvinist people, though there was definitely some other Protestant denominations also represented. And they were hugely reliant on this massive slave labor force because they didn't have enough hands to do all the work just within the Boer population. Well, where we see a really drastic change in Boer culture and Boer life and in the existence of Cape Colony is in the Napoleonic Wars. Great Britain swoops in and seizes control of this Dutch possession. They basically take it from the Dutch, and then when the Napoleonic Wars are over, they don't give it back. If you're wondering, well, why the heck would the British, who are fighting the French, take something from the Dutch, who at one time were fighting the French? Well, the reason is that Napoleon easily conquers the Netherlands. He incorporates that into his empire very early in his reign. And so all Dutch possessions then, at least at that point, were viewed as French possessions. So to deprive this really strategic location from their enemy and to alleviate fears that Napoleon might try to do the same thing there that he had previously done in Egypt, and that's disrupt British trade, the British swoop in, they seize control of Cape Colony, and then when the war's over, they say, well, sorry, that's the cost of doing business. We're keeping this. The British almost immediately really irked the Boer population of the colony. I don't want you to think that, the Boers were like, oh, well, they're Europeans, we're fine. No, there was a significant amount of resentment there. And specifically, that resentment was kind of taken to another level in 1834 when British Parliament voted to outlaw slavery. Well, from the Boer perspective, this was an institution that their whole livelihoods revolved around, that they viewed, life without the existence of slavery as pretty much unlivable, that this would have dire economic consequences. And so starting in that year and really carrying throughout the 1830s into the early 1840s, almost the entirety of the Boer population engages in something called the Great Trek. And the Great Trek is simply a modern name, given they didn't call it that at the time, given to this mass migration of Boers where they pack up their stuff, they put them in these huge Conestoga-style wagons, and they travel even more into the South African interior. Specifically into some of the areas that hadn't been settled, areas up in the Drakensberg Mountains. Basically, we're talking like northeastern modern-day South Africa. Well, this area that the Boers move into then is populated by really the one major African empire in southern Africa that had the ability to resist. And that empire was a group called the Zulu. Now, the Zulu were not a people that had always historically been unified. Their unification was actually fairly young, and it actually corresponded with kind of around the same time that the Great Trek and all these changes in Cape Colony are happening. Specifically, the Zulu are united in 1816 by a king by the name of Shaka. And Shaka Zulu, as he's sometimes referred to, was one of these just kind of brilliant military tacticians, regardless of culture. One of these guys that just kind of got it. He understood all the small things that had to go into creating a really cohesive, powerful fighting force. And he uses these military reforms to bring together all of these Zulu, smaller Zulu kingdoms and tribes in a way that made the Zulu a force to be reckoned with. And the Zulu are going to first butt heads with these Boers that encroach on their lands, but later they're even going to go toe-to-toe with the British. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, if you're wondering, well, what the heck does Shaka do that makes the Zulu a force to be reckoned with? Well, first of all, he changes their weaponry somewhat. The Zulu were a group that primarily relied on spears, and they would mostly use a throwing spear and then would charge the enemy. But the problem with relying on a throwing spear is that once you've thrown your spears, then you pretty much have to get really, really close to your enemy to finish them off. So he replaces the traditional Zulu spear, which probably did not go over overly popularly at first, and he replaced it with a much shorter kind of stabbing spear that allowed for close fighting, but also being able to keep your enemy at an arm's length distance. Another thing that he instituted was he phased out a larger kind of heavy wooden shield that they would use and replaced it with a large cowhide shield, which would be light. You could run with this, and he would require his soldiers, to practice with the shield and spear every day, multiple hours a day, almost kind of like Spartan military training. He also organized his army into what were called age groups. So if you were a Zulu male, you started training in Shaka's army at age 6. And you would be trained with other 6-year-olds throughout Zulu lands. And as you would get older, you would continue to serve with that same age group. So by the time that you're like 35 or 40, if you've survived that many battles, you've learned the tendencies of the guys that you're serving next to. You fought side by side with them for decades. So that's something that can't be overlooked at all in terms of just overall, military effectiveness. He really stressed the need for great, especially cardiac training, that these guys, would be required to run, 10, 15, 20 miles a day, fully armed. And oftentimes, if you read stuff from British writings or Boer writings about, fighting the Zulu, they oftentimes comment on how these people would just show up. Like they had no inkling that this enemy contingent was there. The next thing you knew, there was Zulu kind of on the outskirts of a settlement. They would attack and then they would disappear. So they had that quick strike capability. Now Shaka himself is not going to live overly long as this leader. He's going to die out in 1828. But as I kind of mentioned, the Zulu kingdom will stay unified until 1879 and will be extremely capable of large-scale resistance in a part of the world where that really wasn't the norm. So like I said, this migration starts in 1834. It's estimated that altogether somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 Boers will participate in this northeastern migration. And by the end, they're going to come in conflict with the Zulu. There's going to be a number of massacres and atrocities carried out by both sides. But for the most part, the Boers will be successful because of modern weapons in defeating the Zulu and carving out their own independent states. And specifically, the names of those independent states are the Orange Free State, Natal, and Transvaal. And they will remain independent countries for about 50 years or so. The thing, though, about this area that the Boers then and the Zulu inhabit is that they settle primarily in the mountains. Okay, they settle in primarily the area that the British hadn't previously exercised authority because it was kind of rough, remote terrain. Well, in the 1860s, gold and diamonds are discovered in huge numbers in northeastern South Africa. First in Zulu lands, and then later in some of these Boer states. If there's one thing that the British like during this period of time, it's valuable resources. And, as we see play out throughout the world during the age of imperialism, if somewhere has shiny, valuable commodities and the British don't own it, nobody else owns it, you can bet your butt that the British will soon own it. Well, thus is the case with Zululand and these Boer territories or Boer states. In 1879, there's a conflict that breaks out. It's known as the Anglo-Zulu War, in which the British invade and attempt to seize control of this. It's a blatant land grab for resources. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And at first, the initial British army is absolutely massacred. Something like 1,300 British soldiers are massacred by an army of over 20,000 Zulu troops. And it's only after a second, much larger invasion of 16,000 men that they're able to seize control and incorporate this previously independent Zulu territory. There's actually two classic war movies for any of you that are war movie buffs out there. There's Zulu, and then I think the sequel is called like Zulu Dawn or something along those lines. But if you love like an epic death scene where somebody gets shot and they just keel over, that's Zulu for you. So worth checking out. Kind of documents that struggle. Now I mentioned that the Boers had also found gold and diamonds and other very valuable resource deposits in their newly acquired territory, and so the British, after finishing off the Zulu, just kind of continue their march north and try to seize control of these Boer territories in what become known as the Boer Wars, or sometimes you'll see them referred to as the Anglo-Boer Wars. Notice that I say wars in plural. There's actually two separate conflicts, both kind of revolving around the same reason. The first of these conflicts fought from 1880 to 1881. The Boers were very successful in fighting off the British invasion. The second war, though, 1899 to 1902, was a much larger conflict between the combatants. Many historians view, this second Boer War as being the first true modern war, or total war, in modern history. And what I mean by that is that it was a war that really involved every man, woman, and child living in the territory that was being fought over. It was something that the Boers, because they had smaller numbers, and because they were kind of frontiersmen, outdoorsmen, kind of rough and rugged individuals, primarily resorted to guerrilla warfare against British forces. And they would launch these hit and run attacks, and they would poison water sources and everything that kind of goes along with guerrilla warfare. And this was insanely effective. It took a massive, massive toll on the British forces that were trying to carry out this conquest. Well, the British then responded, and this is where the total war part comes in, by burning all Boer farmland. They figure like, okay, if these people won't fight us, we'll just cut off their food supply and we'll starve them. And then any Boer women and children or civilian men that had nothing to do with the conflict whatsoever, that were living in these homesteads and these communities, those people were all rounded up and put in concentration camps. And they were basically held as mass hostages. Like, this is pretty much the British way of saying like, hey, if you're going to play dirty and attack us and not engage in a pitched battle, well, we're going to take all your family members, we're going to put you in these prisons, and they're going to die from disease until you turn in your weapons and give up. And we're going to burn your farmlands, and we're going to burn down your homes until you give up. So while at first I would say that the Boer Wars were definitely in the Boers' favor because they knew the terrain and they had the support of the population, because of the route that the British took, things quickly kind of turned in their favor. And it's believed that by the end of the Boer War, that somewhere in the neighborhood of over 100,000 civilians, including Africans, including people that were enslaved or people that were servants that had nothing to do with this whatsoever, were interred in British concentration camps. And if you look at kind of the death toll numbers from this conflict, and I put a chart that showed some of those in the PowerPoint file attached to this post as well, you'll see that it's estimated that easily over 20-something thousand people die of disease and starvation from within these camps. So this was something that, it made the news worldwide. These atrocities were widely reported. And there was a lot of internal debate, about the carrying out of this war in British Parliament back in London. The end result, though, of this Boer War is that it kind of formalizes or finalizes the creation of the South African state. Ultimately, the Boers will surrender in 1902, and their territories will be incorporated with the British territories as well as the previous Zulu territories to make a new state called the Union of South Africa. And that Union of South Africa will very quickly be given self-rule and dominion status almost immediately. By 1910, they have their own parliament, they're making their own rules. And why this is so important kind of long-term, and why this is something that we're going to come back to again, in a later unit of study, is that in terms of the European population of this British Dominion, the majority population is still Dutch. The majority population is still those Afrikaners, those Boer people, those people that had this long history of distrust and enslavement and subjugation of native peoples that are now going to be given the keys to the car. Hey, run this state within the British Empire. And what you're going to see emerge out of that is a whole bunch of extremely racist, prejudicial laws. So, to paint the picture for lessons to come, if you've ever heard of apartheid, or references to apartheid-era South Africa, or if you're aware of the figure of Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu or some of these kind of great South African figures from modern history, well, the issues that they were fighting over all have their basis with the creation of that dominion in 1910.